Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming today. I'd like to thank everyone for coming today to our Children's Budget Summit 2015. I think this is our 6th year, 7th year, I'm not sure exactly. But awesome day. It was, I really appreciate everyone coming out. We should probably all actually be sitting outside having lunch since it's finally, the heat has broken finally. Couple of just logistic things. If you need to go to the restroom or anything, they're just right out these doors and around the corner. And a couple of things to point out. We're going to be using, if you're doing social media, we're using the Twitter hashtag #InvestInKids. But in addition to that, we have a social media kit on our website at firstfocus.org. If you want to go there, and there's sample tweets, Facebook posts. And also links to infographics or our budget report if you want to use those, whatever. But also, and after the fact, we'll be posting all the presentations on our website. So do not feel the need to, if people are going too fast, because I'm going to be doing that. Unfortunately, I should have been a college professor. I didn't realize that until I took this job. But I will be running through a lot of slides about some of the data, but you can find those on our website. So before we start, I just wanted to first and foremost thank Sarah Kyle and Elliot Gluck in our office. They put together this year's book, and so as you go through it, you can see lots of information. And 2 people did this, and it was a ton of work. And I also want to acknowledge Jared Solomon, who's here today from Senator Casey's office, and he used to work for us and did this work too. So it's a bear, but I think it's a useful tool for people in the field and in the children's advocacy community. And feel free to call us anytime if you have any questions or you need information, or we can be helpful with the data. And what it is data. What we don't have in there is what the policy should be around it and things like that. We also have those if you have questions around that. But what it really is intended to be as a tool for folks to use in their work. So I'll just jump right in and talk about some of the data that we have. So the first and foremost kind of top line issue for you to know is that the share of federal spending for kids has now dropped below 8%. And so what we see here is it's at 7.89%. And it shows a continuing downward trend. We had a little bit of a bump kind of in 2013, 2014 when sequestration was eased. And that's an important thing to note because discretionary spending for kids, discretionary spending caps due to sequestration disproportionately hit kids. And you can see that when you lifted the caps, actually the share spending went up. So what you can see though, of course, is that over the 5-year period, the share of spending for kids have dropped by over 7%. And back to the sort of discretionary investment, the discretionary spending issue, this is a discretionary spending chart. You can see that over between 2011 and 2015, the share of spending for kids on an inflation-adjusted basis dropped by over 9% and overall 4%. So what this really shows is that not only, some people might say, well, the federal budget, people are squeezing it because of deficits, but the fact of the matter is what this shows is kids are disproportionately taking the brunt of those cuts or freezes and sequestration. So over the 5-year period between 2010 and 2015, discretionary spending for kids is down 11.6% on an inflation-adjusted basis, and you can see the numbers there. And then I want to talk about a few specific issues. So education is an example of this. And so we had No Child Left Behind when it passed. There was an initial increase in funding for education. So what we've done is imposed standards and all kinds of things on state and local governments and schools. But what you can see is that funding for kids in education has dropped pretty dramatically since 2010 by over 16%. And not only is this a federal cuts, but even more important is state and local government cuts have also been occurring. And there's a chart on our website that shows that as well. And the Center on Budget has a great data on sort of the level of cuts at the state and local level in states. I would also note, if you think about some of our most vulnerable kids in our society and who are, in terms of funding to combat child abuse and neglect, you can see that spending there is also down by over 10% over the period. So, so I wanted to talk about sort of where the public stands on this. So the good thing is the public's on our side on this. They do not think this is the priority the federal government should make, and they believe that we should be making investments in kids. And so first and foremost, this is a poll by American Viewpoint. They're a Republican polling firm, and they show that over 2/3 of people are not confident that life for children in the next generation, will be better off than it has been for us. And this is a fundamental shift from when I started at our job, where people believe in the American dream. People believe strongly that the next generation should be better off. And what you can see is 2/3 of the American public no longer believe that that's what's happening. And it's not just our poll. There was a ABC News poll that showed very similar numbers to this. And you can see it's bipartisan. This is not a great chart in this kind of room, but what you can see is Republicans by 80 to 18% believe this. And so even more strongly are concerned about how the next generation fares. So it's a tripartisan issue for people. But also we asked the question of people, American Viewpoint was very interested in the fact that we know in polling that if you ask people, do you support kids, people say yeah. And so the question is what's the depth of that support? So they asked people the first question of, do you believe that the federal budget is an important, significant issue for our country? And if people answer the question yes, then they ask them the question, what programs do you think should be cut? And I will note that there are programs that people actually on a majority basis said should be cut. But I wanted to demonstrate here that, we talked about the third rail of things that people don't want to cut, Social Security and Medicare, and there is strong opposition to cutting them, as you can see. But I will also note that that some of the children's programs fare very well in this regard too. About 3/4 of people do say we should not cut education and child funding to prevent child abuse. 2/3 say they don't think we should cut children's health, and pretty close to that for Head Start. But I would also note the strongly opposed. If you have a strongly opposed, what pollsters will say, if you have an opposition that's strongly opposed to something over 40, you've got an issue. And you can see that the strong opposition in basically education and child abuse, for example, preventing child abuse, are pretty much the same as Medicare. So there is opposition to making budget cuts that we're seeing happening, but in an intensity level that mirrors that of Medicare. People also respond very strongly to positive messages around kids in different frames. They did a series of messages in opposition to spending, and then did a few in support. And what you can see here is that messages around investing in the future, around preparing the next generation to meet the demands of a global economy did very well, and they did very well on a bipartisan basis. And you can see support in the neighborhood of 3/4 or more of people responding to those kinds of messages about investing in the future and our kids. One of the things that we note that is a problem for us is that people don't know a ton about children's programs. So at the height when, a few years ago when CHIP was being vetoed and there was all these votes, there was a huge knowledge about CHIP. People knew about the program because it was in the news all the time. But here it was last year before we had the reauthorization or extension this year. And we asked the question, do you think that CHIP should be extended? And what you can see is 1/3 of the public, it was off the radar screen. So they were like, we don't know what this program is. And so, but after explaining it and after talking to people through it and doing pros and cons, again, we would make the arguments, American Viewpoint made both sides of the argument. What you can see is once people were informed, they were like, oh yeah, 3/4 of Americans said they favored extending the program, and you can see even the opposition dropped slightly. But virtually all the people who don't know moved to support, and you can see the strongly favor went up substantially. It was also an issue that garnered, tripartisan support, and you can see, and then even we asked people if they were, supportive of the Tea Party, and they showed by 2/3 of voters who expressed that they were supporters of the Tea Party said they thought we should extend CHIP. So you had really strong support, and I wanted to make note that one kind of interesting thing that we're beginning to see in polls is there's always been a gender gap. There's always been stronger support among women than men. But what you're seeing is in the younger generation, that gap is disappearing. And this is a CHIP example, but this isn't across the board. We've seen this across the issues. And whether that is a better recognition of men, of younger generation about equality and gender roles, I think this is an important thing to note because this bodes well for the future for kids because you're seeing young men really responding. You can see among older men over the age of 60, there's a huge gender gap. And in CHIP, you'll note that men over 60 actually have a lower support level for CHIP extension than even Tea Party members. So the older generation is something we still need to really work on, particularly men. But you can see women over the age of 60 were astronomically supportive of CHIP. So there's a huge gender gap among older people, not so much younger people. This is, I probably should have titled this slide is, yes, I'm still a little bitter slide. But in the Medicare Access and CHIP Reauthorization Act, I just want to make the point, and this is an important thing for child advocates to think about, is the Medicare doc fix and in the Medicare Access and CHIP Reauthorization Act. So CHIP got equal billing in the title to Medicare. What Congress did was they made the Medicare doc fix permanent, but they extended CHIP by less, and it's not a reauthorization, by the way, it's just an extension, by less than 2 years. And so you can see the dollar amount difference. And so the Medicare doc fix got $175 billion and CHIP reauthorization got less than 6. So as a result, even the share of spending in a bill that has kids in the title, the share of spending for kids dropped because of the passage of this bill. And so I think it's an important thing. I think that we were happy that CHIP was extended, but I think at some point as a community, we've got to say this disparity is not acceptable, that we should have had some parity and we should have gotten full extension of the Children's Health Insurance Program. In addition to that, home visiting only got a 2-year extension. We should be pushing for parity. Failing to invest in our future. The next few slides are a little complicated, but they're trying to get at the issue of, so what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do about it in the states and at the federal government? And so one thing to look at is the Annie Casey Foundation's Kids Count report. We looked at sort of the bottom third of the states in terms of child well-being in their report. And you can see in the red, those highlight where those states are. So predominantly the Southwest and the Southeast. And if you kind of look at where those states are, and then you look at this chart in terms of percent of poverty, it very much mirrors that chart, right? So children in poverty are one of the major results, and it makes sense because poverty has enormous ramifications in terms of a child's health, their education, their social emotional well-being, their housing supports, et cetera. So across the board, this is a significant issue for kids, and we think that poverty needs to be a priority among all kid advocates, not just people who are worried about income issues, but educators and pediatricians, et cetera. So again, there's very huge parallels, and we also know that this is from the Rockefeller Institute. They did analysis on sort of effort, and so you can see that it matters that in the South and the Southwest, there's less investment per child, for example, in education than in other areas, but that is also true in terms of healthcare and income supports and social services. So you can see the lack of investment in comparison to huge investments in places like the Northeast, and it should not be surprising to us then that outcomes for kids are better. But what people could say is, well, those states are poor. They have higher poverty levels. They don't really have the ability to make those investments. So one thing to look at is we looked at the Education Law Center does a report annually that just came out, and it's about school funding fairness. And one of the things they look at is effort. And so they do an effort index. So they look at your spending levels, but they divide it and make a ratio based on your gross state product. So it takes into account whether states have resources. So what they did was then do that and then do a grade. They did a scale of A through F about where states fall on And it's the investments divided by their ability to pay. So some states who don't make a lot of investments but are poor and don't have any resources, they actually don't come out as poorly in this index. So what's happening with effort? And what you can see is that, first of all, in the kids count, you can see the states do very poorly there. So not only are the states poor, but they're not making much of an effort. You see 2 states getting A's, 2 getting B's, 4 getting C's, 1 a D, and 7 F's in terms of their effort. So it's not just a matter that they're poor, they're also not making significant effort in terms of supporting kids. This comes from William Fry. He's at Brookings, and he did a report on diversity and racial disparities. And what he looked at was sort of what are the states that have a racial generation gap, and that is that there is higher proportions of young people who are minority versus older people. So basically, what's the gap there? And you can see states like Arizona are off the charts, 41% gap. So I looked at sort of the top, how many is that? I think that's 16. I think the same number of states that were in the Annie Casey state to say, is there also something there? Is there because of this generation, this racial generation gap, is there something going on there? And is it resulting in some lack of investment in kids? And the answer to that is yes, but I'll start off with a quote from Steve Murdoch. He was the Census Bureau director in the Bush administration, and Michael Klein and Mary Zay. And they note that the future of areas such as the Southwest and of the nation as a whole may be markedly affected by the extent by which its older populations are willing to step forward to support its increasingly diverse youth. What's clearly evident is that the future of the Southwest and the United States as a whole is increasingly tied to the future of its minority populations. And I won't read the whole quote, but what they're really talking to is half of the growth in the nation between 2000 and 2010 were in the state of Texas. And so if states like that, where we're seeing the bulk of the growth, the Southwest particularly, are not making investments in kid, it does not bode well for the future. And so we really need to make a change there and really turn that tide. I don't know why I have that chart again. So one of the things we wanted to do is look and say, okay, so these states that have a high cultural gap, there's been studies that show, for example, that in states where there is a racial generation gap, that there is less investment in education, for example. And so we wanted to look at that here. And so looked at the top third states who have the highest gap, and how are they doing? And what you can see is very poorly. Only 2 of these states got A's, 1 B, 2 C's, 1 D, 10 F's. Lots of overlap with the Annie Casey states, but even with that difference, these states actually even did worse. So they may have better child outcomes because they're wealthier as a whole than the other states that were in the Annie Casey states. But on the other hand, their effort is worse, even worse than those states. So some key takeaways, I think, for us in this is that poor states make a poor effort and have poor outcomes. States with large racial generation gap make even worse effort. And as a result, what do we do about it? And I think that one thing that we would make the point of, and I think many of the people in this room would share, is there remains a critically important role for the federal government to play here in investing in kids in order to combat inequity and disparities among kids in our nation in and between states. If Mississippi is poor and we care about those kids, and those kids are disproportionately African American, for example, or I used to work for Sarah Bingham from New Mexico, those kids are disproportionately Hispanic. It's a very poor state. So there remains an important role for the federal government to play here in helping those kids. And last, William Fry, to quote him in his book, The Diversity Explosion, and I think he comes across, he does an amazing analysis of sort of where things are going in terms of demographics, and he comes away in a positive way. He thinks that we can do this. And as he says, a growing, diverse, globally connected minority population will be absolutely necessary to infuse the aging American labor force with vitality and to sustain populations in many parts of the country that are facing population declines. Rather than being feared, America's new diversity, poised to reinvigorate the country at a time when other developed nations are facing advanced aging and population loss, can be celebrated. And so he welcomes this diversity, he welcomes immigration. I think that this is something we need to really be thinking about and educating people about the importance of making these investments in our next generation. And last, before I turn it over to Patrick, I just want to say that again, the public supports where we're standing from. And so here's some data on kind of even just a few issues. So the idea of cutting child poverty in half in America, you can see very large support. And again, if the intensity level is over 40, you've got an issue. And it's at 68. Extending the child tax credits. Those are expiring in 2017. Those make a huge dent in terms of supporting families in low incomes. And those are have intensity level at 69%. Adopting a children's budget, a very kind of boring issue, right? Like, why would the public have an intensity around that? And you can see the intensity level still is high. Or adopting a bipartisan children's commission. This would be very much like what happened in the early 1990s that sort of led to the child tax credit and CHIP to be enacted. So what we do want to do is promote an agenda that has long-term positive change for kids, and these are 4 of those kinds of things that would have. With that, do we have time for a few questions? Yeah, so if anyone has any questions, and then I can turn over to Patrick. Any questions? Sorry, it was a lot of number dumping. Again, we'll have my slides up on our website, and all this much of this information is in the children's budget book. Yes, Bill.
Bruce, thanks for a very educational presentation. And similar question I think I asked in the past, but how do you think we can mobilize this public support for all these positive things into legislative change?
Yeah, I think that a couple of things. I think we need to build a movement, and I think as a community we need to come together across areas. I think it was huge that, for example, even in the extension of CHIP, that nearly 1,600 groups signed on to that, and it wasn't just the Academy of Pediatrics and First Focus and like the usual suspects that you would think on something like that. I mean, everybody in the children's community signed that letter for there to be 1,600 names, and I think that needs to happen in each issue area. So we have the Child Nutrition Act coming up later this year. The health people need to be supporting the nutrition people and vice versa. So I think that needs to happen. But I also think fundamentally, I think educating people about it really does change people's minds, and that's a goal that we need to continue to make. And the problem is we have a huge country, and that's really hard, but I think a benefit that we have now is social media. Social media provides us an opportunity to really to reach people that normally, as advocates, it would have been very difficult to reach. And so really engaging bloggers and mom bloggers, dad bloggers, and the great thing is people like the Academy of Pediatrics have made things like poverty a huge piece of their agenda as well, recognizing the importance of that to health. So doing those cross work together, I think, is key. So, yes.
Thank you, Bruce. And first focus. Robert Mahaffey. There you go. Hey, Bruce.
How are you?
Robert Mahaffey with the Rural School and Community Trust and president of the organizations concerned about rural education. Can you enlighten us a bit more about geography around the polling, the kids? Did you look at, for example, children that go to schools that are assisted by the Rural Education Achievement Program, for example, population density, those sorts of things? And if you did, can we dig into that? Not today, but I'd be very interested in looking at that in much more detail.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one thing that was interesting is that regardless of geographic area, in some polling that I've seen, there's definitely differences in terms of support among various issues. But on kids, one of the reasons why I don't even show the slide is the numbers were almost identical, whether it was urban, rural, suburban. It was also very strong support, Northeast, Midwest, South, Southeast, which is a good thing. So we have, across the board, we have on a bipartisan basis, on a gender basis, and also geographic, there is support on these issues, and education is, pretty much number one in some respects. That and child welfare really pull off the charts in these areas. And would say that on other things like early childhood and childcare, we have work to do. I mean, they still pull well, but they're among our sectors, it's one of the weakest areas, and that gets back to this gender gap. That's where the gender gap really pops, and doesn't for young men, but it does for older men. Any other questions? All right.